I'm Daniel Bass, manager of the South Asia program at Cornell University.
And I'm Shavin Senavaratner, graduate student in architecture at Cornell and student worker at South Asia program. You're listening to the Next Monsoon podcast, where we examine how art and culture can help us navigate the uncertain future. This podcast is part of a bigger project in the South Asia program at Cornell University. We'll be interviewing scholars from around the world to help us understand how people and artists face climate change.
In this episode, we're navigating matters of political conflicts, social movements, decolonizing methods, and research ethics through fieldwork in Pakistan.
Ahsan Kamal is a lecturer at the National Institute of Pakistan Studies at the Quaid-I-Azam University, Islamabad, Pakistan. He works with activists and communities on issues of land and water commons in Pakistan. His dissertation in sociology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Saving Sindhu, Indus Enclosure and River Defense in Pakistan won their 2020 S.S. Pirzada Dissertation Prize on Pakistan. He recently co-wrote a book chapter called Research as Action and Performance, Learning with Activists in Resource Conflicts.
Welcome, Ahsan. It's great to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you, Daniel and Shavin. It's really lovely to have the opportunity to have this conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
What's your first thought about the word monsoon?
My first thought is it's a season of joy. Growing up in Pakistan, monsoon is always, at the end of a grueling summer. It's a time when, as kids, we would just go out and run and just play in the rain. And then, of course, there's like a whole sort of a cultural thing associated with it. It's a season of longing. So there's a lots of these positive feelings I grew up with. However, recently, given everything that's going on with climate change and disaster, there's definitely sort of a darker undernote to that seasonal shift these days. That's kind of like part of the experience now, unfortunately.
So what inspired you to be part of this project on the Next Monsoon?
Yeah, so just kind of like experiencing what's going on with floods and the kind of work I do with river activists and issues of land and water commons in Pakistan. It's always interesting to see how people in South Asia and outside of South Asia who are concerned about these things are approaching these questions and what kind of learning we can have from each other. So when I had an interaction with Iftikhar Dadi, he was familiar with my work. I was a bit concerned that my work doesn't centrally focus on cultural production as such, or in a way I interpret cultural production very differently from let's say Iftikhar's work or some of the other people. So it just felt like a great opportunity to sort of push myself out of my comfort zone in this kind of academic work.
So how do you think about cultural lenses on climate change can provide a different understanding than a scientific analysis?
Yeah, that's a big question. So for me, I don't necessarily focus directly on, we can think of art as like, artists who are displaying their art in a gallery or exhibition. But it's more about how certain individuals who are witnessing these changes and are working with communities that are facing these conflicts, how are they sort of both witnessing and organizing their thoughts, developing new concepts, what kind of conversations that they're having, what kind of metaphors they're using to describe this new reality. So what I see is that the response to what I would call for instance, the death of the river, and river imagined more holistically, not just as something that flows in a channel, but is connected to the rain and it's connected to the overflows, and how do changes and shifts now appear in this discourse, particularly among activists who are working with communities, and some of the activists that are insiders of those communities. So how are they talking about these things? What metaphors they're using? What kind of poetry they're producing, and so on and so forth.
So building on that, how would you say your research and teaching and activism frame your understanding of climate change?
So the first thing in terms of the combination of teaching, researching, and activism is that you realize that there are these borders that are created between these separate domains. There's a large recognition now in academia that activists and communities are also knowledge producers. But at the same time, how that knowledge travels from these communities, from these activist conversations to academia. And then within academia, the boundaries created between different disciplines prevent sort of deep conversations and interaction of these different modes of thinking about things. So the collaboration is very different from academic collaborations. It has its own timeline. Things happen quickly. Sometimes things move very, very slowly. Academic calendars and productions are very different. So when you kind of move away from these borders just for purely pragmatic reasons, then you also epistemologically move away from dichotomies. Like you just have to have some fluidity and move between these different modes of operation. It makes it slightly difficult as well. So for instance, in my work, I have to read what the engineers are writing about a dam, or what the lawyers are saying about the legal policy, and what the communities are doing. It's difficult to do unless there are a lot of people who have some more expertise in these things, and you can sit with them and talk to them and have some sort of a conversation in these different realms and domains. But I think overall, it really helps you expand the way you look at these problems.
Building on that, you got your graduate training in the United States. You're now teaching in Pakistan. Have you found that border between activism and academia different in those two settings?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, but the answer is definitely yes. I think I teach at a public university in Pakistan. It comes with a whole set of disadvantages in terms of resources and like just the investment. And we all know about the way governments are defunding education and all sorts of things. But at the same time, I feel that if you find that sort of space where you can engage critically and politically, then there's much more readiness among scholars based here in my university, and generally my experience in the global south. They're closer to these activists and communities in resistance in some sense. I'm not saying that no one is able to do that in the US, but personally, I felt outside of some very specific issues, there's a huge distance between the modern elite research university and what the activists and communities are doing, or at least their relationship is more mediated through particular forms of knowledge production in the academy. It's in my experience, there's more flexibility in universities, public universities in the global south, although again there are huge disadvantages as well.
So more about your research and what you do. In your research on riverine activism and water politics in Pakistan, what has been the relationship that you've seen between the fishers, landowners, activists, and politicians?
Right. So I think that's interesting to think about the relationship of these fishers and traditional irrigators, and the landless groups that I have worked with. And relationship with politicians in South Asia. Generally, by politician, we mean someone who is a party representative, like who participates in mainstream electoral politics. And their relationship with politicians is kind of interesting. I mean, these politicians often coming from elite backgrounds, they're either landed or, capitalists. Their interaction is around politics or clientelism. The politicians are obviously more visible and present when it's election season. In my experience, a lot of time, what these communities want, which is to protect their land, their water commons, their forest commons, the politicians don't have the capacity to address those things. The politicians are good for, maybe building a road or investing in a local school. There's very few political parties, and they're not really powerful enough, at least in Pakistan, to sort of take on this whole ideology of development that is creating this dispossession of the people. If we move away from politicians, then there's a lot of politics. There's a lot of sort of self-organizing. There's a lot of social movement activism, and there are sort of indirect channels through which these movements can influence politicians. The way to think about the influence of these organized fishers and landless activists is that they are really transforming the discourse around nationalism. And when I say nationalism in South Asia, we mean ethno-linguistic nationalism, movements for local autonomy, And India has done much better in terms of these recognizing different languages and giving some power by dividing larger provinces to smaller smaller ethno-linguistic groups. But in Pakistan, the tendency is to centralize that state power. So a lot of time, what these fishers and traditional irrigators do, that when they mobilize, their discourse is very much about we are sovereign and we are this is our land, this is our territory that you are taking away from us through these large-scale development projects. And this narrative very quickly latches on to and often transforms the larger ethno-nationalist movements that might be asking for regional autonomy, that might be demanding distribution of power in the federation. And that can then influence electoral politics. Mainstream politicians are then forced to include these demands of communities around their right over the land, their right over the river, over the forest, and include that in this high politics conversation.
You had mentioned the land commons, water commons, forest commons. I was wondering for our listeners if you could explain more what that idea of the commons means to you.
Yeah, so for me, generally, it's useful to think about the commons in the distinction between inner commons and outer commons as a distinction that in South Asia, when over the long process of enclosure and introduction of private property regimes introduced by the British, there's certain pieces of land within a village territory that in Pakistan we normally call shamilat. This was a system that predated the British. But basically, in a village, some people have land ownership to private plots, and then they have some common land to which they have access, for instance, to gather wood or as a pasture land for their animals. So there is that sort of inner common but it's limited to that village community. So a lot of these processes, what happens is if there's a big development project that requires land acquisition by the state only pays for the privately held land. So, if you're landless and you had access to the commons, you're completely displaced. And for even if you're a landowner, you're only compensated for the land that you have a title to, not for the access to the commons. So that's kind of like one. But the other is the outer commons, which in that sort of way of thinking about how Europeans have transformed by colonizing this land. The outer commons can refer to the territory that is not part of a village community. Like it's not just the privilege of a village community member to access, but these could be the forests between different villages, the pastoral lands over a large area, right? So these outer commons were also very central to the political economy, and the dispossession is at that level as well.
Much of your research has been on communities along the Indus River, and I was wondering how are the issues that face them, how are those similar to communities along other rivers in Pakistan or elsewhere in South Asia?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. Obviously, as you guys are well familiar with this South Asian problem, is that you can't hop over the border and do that sort of work in India. It's just like unfortunate. There's a whole sort of Indus Water Treaty that people familiar with South Asia would know about. And the distribution of rivers, the division of these waters is like a silly notion between these two nation states. But then they're among other silly notions that these two countries, the division and the partition of South Asia have. This one is one of, it's really right up there. But just to answer your question, so I have a way to think about the Indus River. One of the things is that it has that sort of significance, right? It's both symbolically and just materially the largest, most significant river. The first large-scale project in the Indus River was the Sakhar barrage in 1930s. And the barrage and canal colonization of the other rivers of the Indus Valley, that began in the 1850s. So, it's like literally like 80 years of development in other parts, finally getting to the Indus River. It's something that I haven't like really thought through, but it's kind of like really interesting that Punjab, being in central Punjab in particular, around these other rivers, is like overdeveloped for a longer period of time with canal colonization. And as scholars have mentioned, that this canal colonization wasn't only an infrastructure project, it was a social re-engineering project as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of the largest towns in central Punjab did not exist before canal colonization. Pakistan's second biggest town, Faisalabad, which has been called the Manchester of South Asia at some level, at some point, because it produces a lot of cotton. It did not exist. It did not have that sort of strength. So one has to sort of think about that there is a deep socio-ecological transformation that happened in parts of these central Punjab. And ideas about river defense perhaps were influenced by this long-term transformation and politics that were shaping here, as compared to the Indus, where this death and destruction and the flows are sort of emerging at a time when our awareness of the ecological harm of this project is also increasing. Our awareness of the climate change is also increasing. The dynamic outside of the Indus Basin are different. Generally, these are seasonal rivers. And so in particularly in Balochistan, they're also implicated in a very violent conflict between the Pakistani military and some Baloch nationalist groups. For the military, they're the separatist terrorist group. For a lot of Baloch, they are the sort of freedom fighters and liberators. So that conflict is there. So politics of the river is kind of, in a way, is just like hidden. I mean, it's there. Communities are mobilizing, but it's kind of hidden in that sort of big conflict and theater of war and all that's happening.
You talked about riverine communities addressing or having an awareness with climate change. I was wondering if you could share more examples of how these communities are facing the growing climate crisis, and how are their reactions different from the bigger state?
Right. So a very sort of good example or way to think about this is to look at the long history of mobilization of groups like Pakistan Fisher Folk Forum and the Sindhu Bachao Tarla and what they have been doing, and comparing it to this recent project, the Living Indus project, that has become sort of like the centerpiece of the Pakistani government's after the 2022 floods. It's one of the projects that the government is promoting as addressing Pakistan's climate change problems, climate adaptation problems. But there's a distinction, there's a difference between how these communities mobilize and this mainstream project of Living Indus. And the biggest difference, as I was speaking earlier as well, is that the communities embed their demands in ideas of regional autonomy and sovereignty and control over their own resources, and to question the whole sort of system that takes away these resources from them. So that's one. The second thing is that a lot of the fishers and traditional irrigators are very much against the large infrastructure development, particularly dams and canal irrigation, like huge investments in that system.
Yeah.
And if you ask any hydrologist and environmentalist worth asking, then they will tell you that this long-term destruction of the Pakistani ecological system is largely attributable to these large infrastructure projects. So the communities are very clear on that. They want alternatives. They say that they are traditional practices. Now, of course, we need to rethink how these traditional practices can be adapted in this modern sort of economy in some ways, but they're very clear on how to do it. On the other hand, if you look at the Living Indus document, while it speaks a lot of there's a lot of interesting talk about river health and ecology. At the same time, it is insisting on sort of continuing and even expanding that infrastructure project. And there is no sort of real recognition of the claim of the local groups and communities on their own resources. So what ends up happening is that it will become like this top-down, heavy-handed infrastructure development project. And from historic experience of large projects of climate-related issues in Pakistan, we see, as we call it here, it's all about the TECA. TECA is like the contract, right? So whenever there's a contract to be had, whenever there's a cement to be poured into a problem, you will find the government and the contractors and everyone will be happy there. But if it's about restoration of the water and the river and the aquatic life and all sorts of things, they're going to stay away from this.
How do you frame and conduct your academic research in a way that facilitates agency and advocacy among some of the activist communities that you work with?
As privileged knowledge producers, and academics are part of that knowledge production system. And again, the closer you are to the elite institution, the global north, the more power you have in terms of, right? So even for me, even if I'm working in a university in Pakistan, public university in Pakistan, having had a degree from the US, and again, the fact that I'm in this podcast, having networks, and I have more voice and more agency. So first of all, to just acknowledge that we have this power, and if we are not really careful, then we will end up sort of representing these communities and what they're trying to do with our own sort of frames and our own understanding. One is just the analytical representation of reality, right? Like as scholars, we look at reality, we represent it with our theories and sort of simplify, rarefy it. And then there's a political representation, which is where communities or anyone can stake claims that this is our demand based on this knowledge. And so it's very sort of important for researchers like myself to really understand the dual problem of representation. And, so to give or to not subsume the agency for self-representation or articulation of their own problems in their own idioms to these communities. One easy way to do it is to just use our own sort of concerns of high theory and not listen to what they're saying and what concepts that they're using and how they're imagining the world and the problems and they're trying to represent. So that's easier said than done in practice. I mean, again, within academia, there are like a lot of the easiest thing to do is to cite XYZ and say, okay, look, I'm being careful. It's a way to just use someone else's authority to lessen the burden on you. But the way I would approach this is to have some commitment. Are you committed to this problem? Are you really concerned about that your act by default is designed to subsume there as an agency because of the history of how knowledge production is implicated in imperial colonial processes, right?
Yeah, no, I asked because this is something I've struggled with for 20 some years. Did my PhD research with Tamil tea plantation workers in Sri Lanka and issues of ethnic and political organizing and this issue of I had a voice and access to power and could have people in quarters of power here, and that was good, but also what am I giving back?
Yeah, and also I think that just thinking and ethically as a question, when we produce knowledge, as if I write or present a paper, I have a lot of fears who will listen to what I'm saying and they will point out flaws and they will hold me accountable, basically. Whether they do it nicely or, in the usual way that academics do it by taking someone down, this is like an accountability mechanism. They're saying, look, what you're trying to say, there's a lot of people who are thinking about this. So come on, just listen to all of these people. I think there's complete lack of that accountability to community that we're researching. When I say that, some people do it and they do it very, very well.
Yeah.
But there is no sort of institutional requirement for us to go and say, okay, I'm writing about this community. Let me go and present this work in front of them and see what they say and try to modify what I'm saying. Some people will do it, but I think there's some sort of a lack of this institutional accountability.
Is there for you personally a framework so that you can follow by or to think about how you can advocate for them?
I feel is very important is, for me personally, is to have conversations with activists and not just an interview with an activist or a simple sort of ethnographic kind of engagement. If we take them as knowledge producers that are not just community members, but have been forced to think about, a lot of time activists just have conversations with each other. And a lot of time it's just about concept X and concept Y. And it's you're just there's so much conversation about the conversation of that concept and there's so many, it just feels very much removed. But I think that sort of same commitment does not exist in terms of conversations with these activists and recognizing them as flawed human beings and as having flaws, as all theories have flaws, but as our limitations, but recognizing this, that they have existential stake and they are not only facing the impact of these changes, but they're deeply concerned about how do we bring about a transformation.
Bringing some things back to the world of academia, in what ways do you see feminist and critical theory intersecting with your research in Pakistan?
So the exposure that I've had as someone who went to, let's say, the US to study social sciences, and before that I was trained as a computer scientist and engineer, the story of South Asian middle class mobility aspiration and all that. So I hardly read anything other than the Pakistani state, what they wanted me to read, or what I would find, outside of. So my exposure to critical theory was at first indirectly in conversations with people in Pakistan, and again some activists. Again, coming from Pakistan, where generally men are, their views about feminism, by and large, statistically, are quite, they're ridiculous, essentially.
Yeah.
And so having grown up in this society and being socialized in that way, I was obviously carrying some of those views deeply inside. So it's conversation with both by reading books and in seminars and some wonderful activists and some wonderful scholars has been really foundational in expanding my mind around these things. And for me personally, it really shines a light on the limitations of my project. Like, most of this, I've been talking about communities and work. I don't know, maybe this is the thing, कि कान इधर से ना पकड़े. You can, जब आप इधर से पकड़ सकते हैं, when you can sort of hold your ear from this side, you don't have to hold it from this side. And so for sometimes it feels like reading too much theory is like, holding your ear the wrong way, in the difficult way. I don't know if this is going to translate in the audio. It's a barrier. The critical theory is very good, expansive, but it also creates limits. So I definitely tell students that you need to trust where you're coming from, your insights about these things, take these ideas, but think about where your ideas are. I have exposure to this beautiful heritage of South Asian culture and knowledge, and these moments of resistance in poetry and verses. And so sometimes theory is great for expanding our mind. Also, and critical and feminist theory are really something that we need to take the basic lessons from there. But sometimes these can also be really, really just they put limits on the way we think about these things.
Yeah.
No, that is true. That is true.
What do you think is at stake for the floodplains communities?
Everything. It's, as I say, it's existential. Before the existential threat to the planet will survive. Even large sections of humanity will survive. But the floodplain communities, they've lost. They've lost. They're slowed on this destruction that has been happening. I mean, now we have scientific knowledge, and these communities have, every time I go, I ask them, when did it start? When did this destruction start? They remember it ever since they were born. One is lucky in this, and I'm kind of mean half sarcastically, but to migrate abroad to the global north. Like literally we are sinking, and the ship really is migration to the global north. Like there is a ship, and the Indus Valley that are designed as an extraction machine, where rivers and all these lands are literally a machine to extract resources, and there's deep investments in these machines. These infrastructure, it's one of the biggest reason for economic collapse in Pakistan is because of the debt reservicing that happens. And so, it's becoming very difficult. So communities in the floodplains, it's really everything. What is at stake? It's everything. They're losing everything.
I'd say with that in mind, what is a sign of hope in the face of climate change in South Asia?
So I will start with this hopelessness that I do experience. I do think that when we think about next, there is a desire to look for hope. And I feel there is some sort of need to also not dwell in depression, but to think that this is the difficult thing here is, as I was saying, that the people who devise these things are then put in charge of creating projects like Living Indus. And that's where sort of it really, really is depressing. They are the ones who are going to solve this problem by doing more of the same. So there is that. And activism is premised on hope of trying to change things. And I feel really hopeful when I sit with these activists, and they're mobilizing, and they're fighting these fights in the face of this situation of hopelessness often. And I don't know, just people who are fighting this fight, that definitely gives me hope.
That's it for today's episode on the Next Monsoon.
This is the last episode of Season 1 of the Next Monsoon podcast. We will be returning next year with Season 2. We would like to give special thanks to Sam Lubowitz and Angelica Kramer at Cornell's Language Resource Center for their assistance with recording this podcast. Shivin Senavaratna not only co-hosts this podcast, but is also our editor. Funding for the podcast and the entire Next Monsoon project comes from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please follow the South Asia program on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SAP Cornell. You've been listening to music by SAP Administrator Gloria Lemus Chavez and her partner Brandon Kane. Make sure to check out more of their work in the show notes.
The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast do not reflect those of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Cornell's Office of the Vice Provost for International Affairs, or any other official entity of Cornell University.
I'm Daniel Bass.
And I'm Shivin Senavaratna.
Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for new conversations and stories on the next monsoon.